Thank you very much, VP Susantono. All of this would not have been possible without your great leadership. And of course, without the full commitment of the bank to all the reform efforts we are embarking on right now. And I think this is where it becomes now really challenging. How do we implement all these reforms? How do we make this change possible? How do we sustain the successes we've seen already in the last year? And I think that's where behavioral science really comes in. I think we have applied a lot of nudges in the last year. We have reduced sludge in the organization so that people embrace knowledge management. They see it part of their work. They see it as an integrant, as a vital aspect of being at ADB. And so we are very happy to have a very special speaker with us today. But before I introduce him, I would like to actually hand over to our General Counsel, Tom Clark, because he knows Cass very well from his work, obviously. And now, please, Tom, if I can, over to you, please.
Thank you very much, Suzanne. Good morning. It is really a distinct honor and pleasure for me to be able to introduce Professor Cass Sunstein. I actually first got to know Professor Sunstein through this wonderful book, which I proudly have on my shelf. I've had it in my possession for the last 30, well, I don't even want to say how many years it's been, but when I was a first-year student at Columbia Law School, during which time Professor Sunstein was actually a visiting professor there on the side of his brilliant career at Chicago and then later Harvard. I can't think of any other phrase to describe Professor Sunstein than being a true Renaissance man. It's really a little bit, I think, the envy of all lawyers to be able to be a brilliant constitutional scholar and then to go on and to do so many amazing things in the broader area of social policy, of development. Obviously, we're going to talk a lot about behavioral insights, but his resume is one that is really for the ages. And for the non-lawyers here, I'd just like to very briefly, introduce Professor Sunstein, if I may be so bold as to call him Cass, because I know he is very engaging and friendly and approachable. Let me just briefly say that if you go back and look at constitutional law over the last 30 years, the name of Cass Sunstein is just legend. He's been a great professor. He has written literally, the horn books on the subject. He has been, in fact, the leading scholar of constitutional law, really the go-to person in this area. He's been the author of hundreds of articles and dozens of books. Today, we're going to talk a lot about Nudge, and of course, he's the author of Nudge: Improving Decisions About Health, Wealth, and Happiness, together with Richard Thaler. He was the author of Simpler: The Future of Government in 2013, The Ethics of Influence in 2015, Impeachment: A Citizen's Guide in 2017. As you can see, a lot of these things are very relevant. The Cost-Benefit Revolution in 2018. The list goes on, and it really looks at a broad cross-section of issues that are increasingly critical to us as a society. Professor Sunstein has testified before numerous congressional committees on many subjects, and he's been a highly valued advisor to the United Nations, to the European Commission, to the World Bank, and to many individual nations on issues of law and public policy. He's also an advisor to the Behavioral Insights team in the United Kingdom. Of course, from 2009 to 2012, he served as administrator to the White House Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in the Obama administration. And after that, he served on the President's Review Board on Intelligence and Communications Technologies and on the Pentagon's Defense Innovation Board. In 2018, he received the Holberg Prize from the government of Norway, which is often described as the equivalent of the Nobel Prize for law and the humanities. And in 2020, the World Health Organization appointed him as chair of its technical advisory group on behavioral insights and sciences for health. Now, of course, he is the Robert Walmsley University professor at Harvard, which is really the highest degree of distinction for a professor at Harvard University. And he is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at the Harvard Law School. So Without further ado, and greatly looking forward to the very inspiring remarks that I'm sure he will make, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce to this distinguished audience Professor Cass Sunstein.
Thank you so much for that. I am honored to get to speak to you all. It's a tremendous pleasure as well as an honor. And as I think of those things I'm supposed to have written, I guess I did write them. I think I must be old. Okay. Thank you for having me. And I have a story to begin with. It's a story about behavioral science. It's a story about development, but it's development in my country, the United States. Children are entitled by law, if they're poor, to free school meals. And the problem that policymakers faced was that the parents were not signing them up for those meals. So you have many millions of children who are entitled to free school meals and need those free school meals because they don't have money, who are not receiving the school meals. That's a policy challenge. We're speaking of breakfast and lunch. One idea was you should inform the parents that they should sign their children up. Another idea was you should scare the parents about the harms if their children aren't receiving those meals. A third idea is you should engage the children directly to get them to encourage the parents to sign them up. The behaviorally informed policymakers thought those are not good ideas. We have a better idea. And the better idea is to enroll those children automatically in free school meals if you know that those children are eligible. So the knowledge of behavioral science suggested automatic enrollment would be a good idea, and the knowledge that some places had of who was a poor child would be used. As a result of that simple initiative, it's extremely simple. At last count, 15 million children in the United States were enjoying those free school meals, 15 million. And while I've been involved with many policies, I have to admit that this is the only policy initiative that I have a hard time describing without crying. And the reason is, I'm not crying, I'm succeeding in not crying, but the reason is that 15 million is a number, but if you saw on screen, let's say 12 of those children, maybe 8 years old, maybe 7 years old, maybe 11 years old, it would be hard to get through the next 30 seconds without a tear. That's a story about the use of behavioral science. The World Bank recently said policymakers are increasingly turning to the behavioral sciences to tackle policy challenges, including energy, conservation, education, productivity, sanitation, strengthening institutions, and reducing corruption. Secretary General of the United Nations recently said behavioral science is a critical tool for the UN to progress on its mandate. It can contribute to improving public health and safety, promoting gender equality, strengthening peace building, and all of the Sustainable Development Goals. The World Health Organization has created a unit that is specifically designed to use behavioral insights and behavioral science to combat not only COVID-19, but a wide range of health-related challenges. What I'm going to do in these remarks is to do a little book. It's going to be a very short book. I've been in the government for the last year and I haven't been allowed to write books, so I've written a little book for you. It consists only of 3 chapters. The first is called Humanity, the second is called Sludge, and the third is called Feast. So remember that if you would, Humanity, Sludge, and Feast. What we've learned over the past 30 years from research is that human beings depart from perfect rationality in predictable ways. These departures are true for individuals trying to handle poverty and get out of it, for businesses trying to grow, for nations trying to succeed under challenging times, and for institutions of all kinds trying to do the best they can in either easy or difficult circumstances. And I'm going to describe 5 behavioral biases, each of which has volumes of research behind them. The first is human beings benefit from or suffer from unrealistic optimism. I'm going to give you an example which you may have encountered. 90% of drivers have been found to believe that they are better than the average driver. Smokers are aware of the statistical risks of smoking, but in one study, smokers believed that they personally were less likely to get lung cancer and heart disease than the average non-smoker. Pause over that if you would. Accurate knowledge of the statistics, but a belief that they were personally less at risk than non-smokers. 94% of professors, I'm ashamed to say, believe that they're better than the average professor. And 100% of people believe that their sense of humor is better than that of the average person because they know, each of us knows, what's actually funny. These are examples about individual optimism. I've said that something I have in mind will, I think, resonate. Human beings are subject to the planning fallacy. And this is true for institutions as well as individuals, where if we think something will take 6 months to complete, it typically takes 9 months or a year to complete. If we think something will be simple to accomplish in 2022, often it's lucky if we can finish it by 2024. That's an example of the planning fallacy. It turns out that just today was released research showing that workers who are about to return to work amidst the pandemic become quite optimistic about their own health future. As they return to work, optimism kicks in. This can be a wonderful thing. It can help us perform well and keep our spirits up. It's not bad that we are unrealistically optimistic, but it can create serious problems with respect to development, and it needs to be counteracted by a dose of realism. The second feature of human beings to which I want to draw attention is that people suffer or benefit from present bias. Today and tomorrow really matter. We can maybe see this in our own lives. The future is a foreign country, call it later land, and we're not sure we're ever going to visit. For institutions dealing with budget issues, or for individuals dealing with health risks, or for nations trying to handle a long-term problem, present bias can be a serious challenge. We know, third, I'm almost halfway through the list of 5, that human beings are likely to procrastinate. Inertia is an extremely powerful force, which means for an institution, the United Nations, the government of whatever country you have in mind, sometimes the World Health Organization, with which I'm privileged to work, inertia can be a very powerful force, which means that altering institutional practice, even with the advantage of new knowledge, can be very difficult. We know, fourth, that human beings have limited attention, that the number of things on our view screen is much larger than the number of things to which we attend, which means that when individuals are making choices, often they will blunder because they look at 3 things that matter rather than 7. And this is true for governments and private organizations as well. We know, fifth, that in assessing risks, people and institutions tend to do one thing. They ask, can I think of an example in which that risk came to fruition? If there hasn't been a pandemic for decades, people might think we don't have to worry about a pandemic. If there has been, let's say, a crime, serious crime in the neighborhood, people might think the likelihood that I will be subject to a crime is 90%, maybe higher. Statistical knowledge is better than anecdotes and recent experience, but statistical knowledge is often crowded out by what is recent and top of mind. If we put these things together, optimism, present bias, inertia, limited attention, and poor risk perception, we can have an assortment of problems for individuals and institutions. The good news is that there are interventions that we know help. Let's call them sometimes educative and sometimes architectural. So we can divide the universe of nudges into two simple categories, where many of them are simply giving people information that's clear and simple. It might be a warning. It might be a reminder in which phone calls are made or text messages are sent once every 2 weeks. It might be information that's provided in a simple, clear way that might counteract limited attention or unrealistic optimism. And when institutions perform well, often it's because educative nudges are part of their structure, and it's often because they are deploying educative nudges to try to help the people with whom they work. Other nudges are architectural. They might involve something like what I described at the beginning, where people are automatically enrolled in a certain kind of system. One example that might be familiar is an easy way to save money is to have automatic double-sided printing. So if people want single-sided, they have to make a choice. A very good way to reduce greenhouse gas emissions is where it's feasible, automatically to enroll people in clean energy sources, subject if they want to opt out. Simplification is a terrific way of increasing architecture in the interest of efficiency and the use of knowledge. I'm done with the first chapter of my short book of 3 chapters. That's humanity. The second chapter is called Sludge. And I'm going to give you a little example. Let's pause over how to evaluate it. Let's just notice the facts. In December of this year, the Dominican Republic drew more tourists than it had ever done in its history. It drew 700,000 people from abroad. In 2021, the Dominican Republic had nearly 5 million visitors, more than any country in the Caribbean. The country looks like it's having its best year economically in 30 years. How did the Dominican Republic do that? The way it did it is it reduced the administrative burdens placed on incoming travelers. It is an outlier in the simplicity of the process the tourists have to go to come in. As a result, 700,000 visitors in December. What the Dominican Republic did was to reduce sludge, understood as paperwork requirements, waiting time, in-person travel requirements, navigability challenges, which are often an obstacle to development all over the world. And I'll just note that I've worked a little bit with officials in the Dominican Republic, and the problem of sludge is something they are very alert to, where we understand sludge to be administrative burdens of many diverse kinds. My government, the United States government, by recent count, imposes 11 billion hours in paperwork requirements on people. 11 billion hours. That's a result of what we might call a sludge audit, by which we assessed how many hours do we impose. If people were perfectly rational, that sludge would often be a wall between humanity and things that are really important to them. But since we know from the opening remarks, chapter 1 of this tiny book, Humanity, people procrastinate. They have limited attention. They are often unrealistically optimistic. They show present bias. That constellation of features of our species can mean that sludge is devastating, both in government services and in performance of institutions. It's actually worse than that. Some of the most exciting work in behavioral science in the last, I think, 100 years shows that if you are poor, sick, elderly, lonely, or really busy, your mind doesn't have a lot of processing capacity. You're like a computer that lacks bandwidth. That means sludge can often, for the people whom we are trying to help, be worse even than anticipated. Because poor people, often women who bear the burden of sludge and administrative requirements frequently, often women, poor people, the elderly are particularly subject to sludge. And that means that the wall is really so tall that sludge can create an insuperable barrier for people, and this is a cruel irony, for people in institutions that are trying to get help. What might be a response? A sludge audit, in which there is some effort to discipline the imposition of sludge, both at, say, the United Nations and at development banks and at departments and ministries, and within the interaction between institutions and citizens. And I'm pleased to say that the Biden administration did something relatively recently that got applause from people who didn't vote for him and don't want him to be reelected. But they applauded this. And it's called a customer service executive order, which requires all sorts of steps, specific steps, to reduce the sludge. What it refers to explicitly is a time tax, and the idea is that we are going to cut the time tax imposed within institutions and imposed by institutions on the people with whom institutions deal. Shall I give you a few examples to be concrete about sludge reduction? Our Secretary of State has to design a new online passport renewal experience. No physical documents, none. Our Secretary of Labor has to allow routine medical treatment appointments using telehealth. Our Secretary of Health and Human Services has to eliminate face-to-face interview requirements and require pre-populated electronic renewal forms so that people are automatically enrolled in and continue to have access to important programs. Think of these as examples of sludge reduction exercises that can make a massive difference to real people. I'm going to give you an example that's most relevant, I think, to your work, which is potentially the most impactful of everything in this recent executive order. And I'm almost going to quote it because it's, I think, a little like a poem. Executive orders rarely have words that sound like poems. It's a little like a poem. The United States Agency for International Development, it doesn't rhyme, but a little poetic, shall review and revise regulations, forms, instructions, and other sorts of guidance relating to the application for grants and cooperative agreements to ensure that such policies are clear and intelligible, do not contain unjustified administrative burdens or excessive paperwork requirements, and here's the best part, do not place undue burdens on local organizations and underserved communities. That's a little revolution, that almost poem. I'm done now with chapter 2 of the 3-chapter book. You ready for chapter 3, the last of the 3? It's called Feast, as I promised or threatened, and the word feast is an acronym. It is meant to capture streams of work, both within governments and development organizations at the World Bank and the United Nations, at universities in Germany and the United Kingdom and South Africa and Canada. And each of the letters in the Feast framework is meant to signal a behaviorally informed approach to policy. I'm going to save the F for last and start with the E. E is for easy. The basic idea is if you want to make something change, behavioral economics 101 says, make it easy. I gave you an example at the beginning involving kids getting free school meals. The basic idea was the problem is it's hard, and the parents are busy. They're poor. Make it easy. Make it automatic. For many beneficial programs in the world, the take-up rate is between 40% and 60%. Pause over that if you would. I was a literature student in college. I didn't study math. I wasn't very good at it. But even I know if the take-up rate is 40 to 60%, then the non-take-up rate is 40 to 60%. And that's a human tragedy for development in particular. I've spoken to leaders in very poor nations, and this is something that they are acutely aware of. They may not have the number, but they know that the beneficiary group is much smaller than the intended beneficiary group. And that's a severe obstacle to development. What can be done? Make it automatic, as in the example with which I began, if you can, and make it simpler and easier so it meets people where they are if you can't make it automatic. And that can drive the take-up rate up dramatically. The gold medal winner for behavioral science as applied to development and policy is the E in the FEAST framework. The silver medal at the Behavioral Economics Olympics, second place, is the S, and the S is for social. And the basic idea here is that social norms are extremely important, and for development and policy, banks, governments have not sufficiently exploited the power of social norms. I'll confess I had lunch with an anthropologist day before yesterday who works in poor countries all over the world. And I asked, what should we know about behavioral economics and behavioral science and behavioral insights that maybe we don't know? And from the field of anthropology, and his emphasis was on the immense power of social norms. If people learn that most people are doing something, let's say that's sustainable, then the likelihood that they will do it increases. Publicizing the prevalence of a norm often has outsized impact on behavior, whether we're speaking of smoking cessation, treating people equally, independently of their gender or race or religion, dealing with environmental problems. Knowledge of the existing norm is often a powerful way of fortifying that norm. If the existing norm isn't so good in one or another of these areas, there's recent research which is, I think, more intriguing than anything that came before. And the recent research says, tell people about the emerging norm, not the existing norm. What is increasingly being done by people? It turns out that if people learn what the new norm is, the norm on the horizon, they want to do that too. It's not clear exactly why. They might think they don't want to be on the wrong side of history. They might think that young people are doing it. They probably know. They might think that something is possible that they hadn't thought was possible. But publicizing the social norm is often an overlooked tool in the behavioral toolbox. And it works within institutions as well. The A in the FEAST framework, you've heard the E and the S, says attractive. If you can make something colorful or pleasing to the eye, whether it's vegetables or medical treatment, which is not typically thought to be attractive, but sometimes it can be exciting and pleasing rather than scary, you can generate behavior change. And some nations with respect to COVID-19 have done that to good effect. If it's ugly or scary, it's not likely to work. People's resistance will kick in. The T in the FEAST framework, and we're almost done with the FEAST framework, is for timely. If you give people some educative nudges at an hour where they are not thinking about the problem for which the educative nudges are helpful, then it's as if you played background music to which they will pay no attention. I'll confess that when I was a law student, I asked someone at a large law firm at which I wanted to work what was the best thing about the firm, and he responded, the pension system. I was in my 20s. I didn't know what a pension system was. All I knew was I didn't care. He was giving me very untimely enthusiasm for the pension system. Often development plans go poorly because the information is not provided at the right time to the people whom the information is supposed to benefit. I told you I would leave the F to the end, and I'm going to. And the F word, believe it or not, in this context is fun. Pepsi has found that if it sells a product called Diet Pepsi, it often will do less well than if it sells a product called Pepsi Max. And it might not be because Pepsi Max is more delicious than Diet Pepsi. It might be because Pepsi Max is a fun idea. Max. Diet Pepsi is a worthy and earnest idea. Amazon sells a product, I confess I know, called frustration-free packaging. I'm looking to see if I have an electric razor in this office. I do not, but electric razors come in frustration-free packaging. That's fun. You open it up and there's the razor. There's no plastic. There are no wires. You won't get cut. You won't need a scissors. You won't need to work to get the product that you purchase. I got curious about what frustration-free packaging was about, and it's actually about the environment and sustainability. It's about solid waste disposal. It's about plastics. And the basic idea is that this product is environmentally preferred. But it's sold as fun, something like Pepsi Max. With respect to many behavior change initiatives, we do something like, let's say, Diet Pepsi. We give people a sense that it's worthy and virtuous. That sometimes works. But if you can accompany that by giving people a smile and a laugh and a sense that this is pleasing or will make their life more delightful, that can have a much larger impact than making people think it's virtuous. If they have both, then that's a terrific combination. Okay, the feast framework, to recapitulate, and thank you for your indulging an acronym. The feast framework is meant to draw attention to the potential benefits of something being fun, or at least in the direction of fun, in terms of getting people to do something, the immense importance of its being easy, where automaticity is the extreme case, the great importance of something being attractive rather than ugly, where you can think of this as about colors and fonts or about just the psychological impact of the intervention. The S is for social. That has immense importance. The T is for timeliness. And the ones to accentuate are the E and the S. The sleeper in the group is the F. Okay, what I've tried to suggest in these remarks is that we know a great deal about the bounded, imperfect nature of human rationality. This is not to say that people are irrational, whether they work with us or whether they are us, or if they're people we're trying to help. But we know that they are departing, and this is really one of the great human achievements, I think, of the last 200 years with respect to knowledge. We know how they depart from perfect rationality: unrealistic optimism, limited attention, present bias, tendency to inertia, a capacity to get hysterical about some risks and to be too complacent about others. We know also that sludge is often a curse, of course, of a particular kind. It's a wall. We need in institutions all over the globe sludge audits that will reduce the volume of sludge so that we can perform better and our programs can work better. We know that the feast framework, which is a work in progress, gives us important clues about why some things are really working in Asia, in Europe, in North America, and why some things aren't working. There's an acronym I haven't invented. No one has. That's the opposite of FEAST. Maybe one of you can come up with it. Some poorly functioning programs are that acronym. Okay, time to conclude. Thank you for your indulgence. I have one kind of question that is meant to unify these remarks, this tiny book you've been kind enough to listen to. And the question is, what are human beings most blessed to have? What's the most precious thing we have, wherever we live? What is that? And in 2012 or 2016, there were many candidate answers, and it would be hard to say which was the best. In 2022, a year when so many of us, and I'm alert to the fact that you all are working every day trying to help on this count, so many of us have lost people we care about, or if we haven't lost them, they've gotten really sick, and we've seen it, or we face that. What is it in this year that is the maybe best or one of the best answers to that question? What is it that we are most privileged or blessed to have? And I think it is a four-letter word, and it's time. Let's find, shall we, ways to give other members of our species more of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cass. This was amazing. And for the audience here, Cass and I, we met at the Summit on Evidence to Policy Making at WHO. And we started to have many conversations at night for me. And Cass really helped us and our team to think about how to apply FEAST to the reform efforts we are implementing with the Knowledge Management Action Plan, and also to understand some of our own behaviors in this during this pandemic, and of course some of the actions we took at the Asian Development Bank. So, Cass, I think you summarized everything we spoke about very well in this book, and I do hope we see this published with a special case study about ADB. And this brings me now to our esteemed panelists here, or I would rather say the talk show that we have tonight. I'm very happy to have here Albert, our new chief economist. We have Bruno, my director general. And of course, we have, again, Tom here, who is the general counsel. So I'm very happy that you are all as excited as I am about having Cass here and listening to this book. And we have many questions for you, Cass. We hope to have more engagement with you. And I think the first one, of course, goes to my boss, Bruno. We had many conversations. Bruno, what do you think? I mean, what can we apply from what Cass has shared with us to our own challenges internally and externally? And what kind of question do you have for Cass that might help, where we can help, where we can probably have his help?
Thank you very much, Suzanne and Professor Sunstein. Excellent presentation. I'm a big fan of yours. I've read your books. I've watched many of your presentations. I think what you've said today is you've brought together a beautiful story across the three chapters of humanity, sludge, and feast. And I think it strikes a chord with all of us at ADB across many of the points that you've mentioned. I do think that humanity is really what brings us here in terms of our writ, which is basically poverty alleviation, supporting a prosperous, inclusive, and resilient Asia Pacific. We do recognize that there is sludge, there is a lot of bureaucracy in the way we work, and we do recognize that that is an impediment, but it's not so easy to reduce it or eliminate it. And that's another very important point. And then thirdly, on feast, I think we definitely understand the importance of doing the right thing and how to do it. And I think that's one of the key points that we're always in dialogue with our developing member countries. The Asia Pacific region, as you know, Cass, is an extremely dynamic region. It is adapting to change very quickly. And we, as the regional institution, in some ways, need to be up to speed and supporting our countries, our developing member countries, in undertaking that change. So these points that you mentioned come to the heart of a lot of the dialogue and the work that we do as the development agency. I particularly liked a reference that you made about institutions, and altering institutional practice is indeed very difficult. And I think, again, that one is one that we do recognize. So for that matter, maybe if I could just take a couple of minutes of your time to give you perhaps some thoughts on something that we're grappling with, and that's a little bit about institutions. So what we're talking about here is we are facing increasingly complex development challenges across our countries. We are generally seen as a bank that has expertise across important sectors. Increasingly, we're asked to blend, integrate more of the thematic considerations into our sector work. I will give you an example. We have great engineers doing wonderful road projects. Now those experts need to bring in things like gender into their projects. How can we perhaps introduce more gender equality in that work? How can we bring in more female workers in that process? A second point, climate change. How do we build the road to be able to sustain a once in a 20-year flood? And thirdly, regional cooperation integration. How can we make that road into a regional network that helps us to break down barriers, so to speak, and have greater integration? Now, that individual, that transport engineer may be very, very good at his sector work, but he may not be at ease bringing in some of the thematic considerations. We have to get him or her out of that comfort zone and be able to better adapt these more important themes now as we build towards more complexity, or we try to address more complexity. How do we do that? And does the behavioral science, the behavioral insights give us something that we can take? Getting people maybe a little bit out of their comfort zones, building more trust in the relations. So I would love to hear from you on that. Let me pause there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. Thank you for the very kind words. It's an honor, really, and I'm in awe of what ATB is doing. So that makes the honor even greater. And, as you speak, I think there's an analogy, which is when I was in the White House with President Obama, we wanted the rest of the government to do various things. And some parts of the government the president wanted to do things were either really busy or not particularly thrilled about the proposal. And how do you do that to get them to do it? Well, the best way to do it is to get them excited about it and to find it is feasible to do it. So what I tried to do from the White House was to find people in the departments who thought this is exciting and fun and an opportunity, or who thought this is something I can handle. So it might be with respect to climate change, people don't want to do it because they think I have no expertise in that, and it seems extremely time consuming and basically impossible. So if there's a way to make them think it's not that hard and it's certainly possible and it's exciting, maybe it'll connect with their own goals. What I would try to do, and in the Biden administration, sometimes something similar, is to think, what do they care about that this will also promote? And if the initiative, maybe it involves gender equality, is something they actually care about, or it's connected with something they care about, call it economic growth, then they have ownership of it. So if it seems an imposition from an outsider, then nobody loves that. But if they feel it's a shared endeavor that they can take pride in, and eventually it's more theirs even than anyone else's, then it becomes a terrific opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cass. I hope everyone here who is part of the cultural transformation leadership team listens to everything you are saying, Cass, because with our cultural transformation, now having the values trustworthy, client-centric, and transformational, I think we have to show everyone what does that mean for them and how we can make it easy to live the intersection of these kind of values, right? And I think this comes also back to what Bruno said. How do we make it easy for everyone to create, develop, design these kind of integrated projects at the same time to feel also they're doing the right thing and not just things right. So talking about doing the right thing and not just things right, I think is a great segue to Tom. Legal frameworks are supposed to make us do the right thing. And I wonder, what are you taking away, Tom, from Cass' book? And how do you see we are doing some of the things Cass is saying already in our legal and policy reform program?
Well, thank you very, very much, Suzanne. And I must say, you really phrased that like a lawyer, particularly your use of the word "should" make us do the right thing, because we have to be careful. Sometimes there's a slip between the cup and the lip, as they say. I was fascinated. And again, let me just extend my great appreciation to Cass for these remarks that I'm still trying to get my head around. It's such a rich presentation, just sort of paradigm for analyzing how we approach things as human beings, and so many things were just literally nails hit right on the head about whether it's the procrastination factor, whether it's just the bureaucracy factor. I know a lot of works have been written on bureaucracy in government and the problems of that, and I think the sludge concept has kind of taken that in a way to a deeper level of analysis and a more practical level of analysis. And there's clearly a lot of lessons learned. I'm confronted with sludge every day, and contrary to expectation, lawyers do not enjoy making sludge. Maybe some do, but we actually like to try to clear it away. And there have to be rules, but obviously you want to distinguish between the value added rules and regulations and hoops people have to jump through to protect ourselves against various risks versus the ones that are just there because I think as one lawyer said, they've been there since the time of Henry VIII. So inertia, and we'll never get rid of them. And I think this framework that Cass has laid out here is very helpful. I guess if I could just take maybe a minute to respond to your question. I mean, the thing that made me most mindful of what we're working on, to which I think this applies, is our law and policy reform program. Because, I mean, as you and many others know, Suzanne and Professor Sunstein, I'm sure you don't, but we do commit a lot of resources in our Office of General Counsel to what we call law and policy reform. And it's something I think we're very proud of, because it really is a service that OGC is offering to really help establish what are the legal frameworks and regulations which will provide the capacity to our DMCs and to their implementing organizations to not only enhance the rule of law generally, but basically to improve people's conditions, to improve their framework for attracting private sector investment, which is another major angle of our strategy 2030. And we, of course, focus on key areas aligned with our broader strategy 2030. So yes, it's the needs of our DMCs around environment and climate change. It's around things like achieving gender equality, the private sector development and PPPs that I mentioned, and advancing the digital economy, which I think you're a brilliant example of the executive order from December and the importance of digitizing things. Gosh, I'll love it when I can get a passport that can be done entirely online. That would be great. Now, one particular area, though, that I think we've been applying, BI, whether explicitly or implicitly, is under our gender responsive judicial systems technical assistance program. And there we've been working with judges and prosecutors to better handle gender-based violence cases, which it's a very sad scourge in many jurisdictions in the region. But in fact, the design of our capacity building program is really informed, I think, by behavioral insights based on feedback and interactions that we have with judges and prosecutors, as well as just the broader community and stakeholders that we engage with. For example, we employ a very holistic and nuanced understanding of local customs, way of life, and human behavior aimed at increasing the efficacy of our capacity building programs. And we look at things like the social roles and behavioral expectations that are linked to the ways that women and girls are treated in the criminal justice system. It also helps in identifying some of the potential behavioral barriers that survivors face while reaching out to the police and other law enforcement agencies and courts. And these barriers can actually prevent them from accessing the formal justice system. So our ultimate goal in all of this is to apply BI, more effectively, and to help build confidence in the formal justice system to help address, gender-based violence in our client countries. Very quickly, I would also say I think that in a number of our LPR priorities, we do use BI to varying degrees. I think that another application of BI that will be useful is under our environment and climate change programs. We're developing, what you might call nudge for nature or green nudges. And I think you've alluded to this in some of your examples. Things we're looking at as a nudge that could be a tool to encourage people to make more environmentally or climate friendly ways to access services, whether it's choosing renewable energy sources, whether it's food choices or farming practices, or even waste management and litter reduction. For example, a study on BI actually informed the European Union's car labeling directive, which requires car makers to provide consumers information to help them buy fuel-efficient cars. So we're looking at analogs that could be done in some of the programs that we're working with in our LPR program. So, the bottom line is, even in the legal field, I do think we need to go beyond the strict black letter law approach and consider these behavioral factors in the design and implementation of our advocacy and our thought leadership in LPR, so that it's based on realistic mechanisms, that can drive the individual and collective decision-making choices. I'm really looking forward to learning more about BI application, and I guess if I could maybe close with a question, Cass, it would be, how do we strike the right balance in applying, the BI concepts in a way that isn't judged to be too paternalistic? Because I think that the positive sides of BI and using nudges you've well laid out. Definitionally, it should be something which, is still choice preserving. I look at the two sub buckets you laid out of the kinds of nudges, and, the informational one, it seems, is pretty clearly benign, and it's just giving warnings or reminders or information. I guess as you get into the other kind, and you can imagine things, whether it's, economic sort of quid pro quos, whether it's, other kinds of regulatory, slightly more coercive nudges, it becomes a little bit more choice destroying. And I just wonder if you have thoughts about, how you can build support by playing up the choice creating rather than choice negating aspects of nudges, and maybe address what I've heard in some literature, I guess, referred to as the dark side of nudges, where people can be nudged to do things that maybe aren't so good for them. I mean, people can use BI obviously in ways that could potentially be, exploitative, or even if well-intentioned, could be perceived by some parties as being, overly paternalistic or interfering in local mores or cultures. And, I would be curious for your thoughts on how we can, set the right balance so that we use the tools effectively, without maybe crossing lines that, could be counterproductive in terms of undercutting support, for some of the programs that use them. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
It's a great question. Thank you. And for the last 6 years or so, I've been engaged in a research project in 17 countries, asking exactly the question you raise, whether people like these nudges. And we've tested a lot of nudges in 17 nations, which include South Korea, Japan, and China. And what I can say is that the first thing that emerges from our research is that people like the nudges. So if people are automatically enrolled in a savings program, do people like that? Yes, strong majorities like that. If people are given information about the calories in their meals, do people like that? Absolutely. So the nudges we've tested as a first approximation, they get significant majority approval in all 17 nations. And the ones people don't like, they fall in certain categories. If people think that money or something is being taken from them without their consent, they don't like that. If people feel they're really being manipulated, they don't like that either. And the category of manipulation is pretty narrow. So people don't think of nudges as manipulative. If they see a policy that has subliminal advertising on the movie screen, that's manipulative. People don't like that very much. But generally, the things we're talking about, architecture and educative, people like them. I can tell you a little bit more that I find fun and a bit mysterious. In the 17 countries, the most enthusiastic pro-nudge nations are you sitting down? China and South Korea. They are the champions. People love the nudges there. Now, we don't know exactly why. And South Korea and China are not identical. But of the 17 countries, they're the most enthusiastic. Here's a country that is in the set of least enthusiastic, Japan. They are positive. But where in South Korea you might have 90% approval, in Japan you might have 60% approval. So they look pretty similar in what majorities like and what majorities don't like. But Japan, a little less. Japan looks like Hungary, by the way, in that way. And then a bunch of countries are the United States, the United Kingdom, Germany, Italy are kind of in the middle, more enthusiastic than Japan, less enthusiastic than China and South Korea. For the dark side, I think we need something like a Bill of Rights for nudging, and it emerges from the data about what people don't like and whether the nation loves the idea of rights or hates the idea of rights, call it whatever you want, a series of restrictions on what nudging can be done for. If people think a nudge is inconsistent with people's interests or values, they don't want it. If they think a nudge is a way for public officials to try to protect themselves, they don't want it. If the nudge is an effort to show favoritism for one group over another group, people tend not to like that, even if they're members of the group that's being favored. So you can build up from engaging with what people actually think, a set of constraints on what nudging should be for. Basically, if we're talking about health, safety, and the environment, economic prosperity, reducing gender violence, the example given, or doing something to make people not get sick from COVID or from even smoking, it would be surprising if that would violate any category of rights that people embrace.
Thank you, Cass. Great insights. I think interesting is the country-specific aspects of nudging, right? So this comes back to differentiated knowledge that we need on country context. I think the other important aspect for us at the bank, what you just said, is we need to have some moral framework to guide, in what kind of framework do we allow these kind of nudges. And for that, I think it is important that we now have these values, because in the past in the bank, we had nudges that nudged people to focus on big loans and get money out and approvals and commitments and disbursements. That was the nudges we gave. So I think that is interesting for us inside the bank to think about new choice architecture to nudge us towards different kind of behavior. And Cass, if I may now invite Albert, our chief economist, about the kind of experiments he has done in the past and the experiments we are now doing together with his team that is leading impact evaluation and that will work with the Innovation Hub. I'd like to invite Albert to share some of the exciting work. And I know you have some slides and you want to excite people, and that's what we need, as we heard, right, to bring people on board. So please, if you can see the slides and then hear from Albert his insights on behavioral insights.
Thank you. And I'm mindful I'm maybe keeping people from lunch, so I'll try to be very quick. I want to thank Cass for a very inspiring and informative and extremely well-organized set of remarks. And I thought it might be helpful to share one study that is about nudges that I think Cass might enjoy hearing about. And this is work being organized by our research department. And the basic idea is that in China, which you just referred to as a very pro-nudge country, the government introduced a new regulation that catering and food delivery services should not provide single-use cutlery unless requested. And this policy reform was rolled out first in a few cities in different timings. And you can see the timing on the right-hand side of this slide. And in response to that, a lot of the online food delivery platforms, including Alibaba's LMA platform, conducted different types of digital interventions to realize this policy. And if you go to the next slide, what we were able to do, what Alibaba did very specifically is they implemented two nudges. One is they changed the default choice from getting the cutlery if you don't choose not to not getting the cutlery unless you actively choose to get the single-use cutlery with your food delivery. And the second was a green nudge where it was part of a broader Alibaba initiative where you could earn green points. And if you chose no cutlery, you get a few of these points. And in the end, if you accumulate enough points, you can actually pay to plant a tree in some watershed area in Western China. And so we took the initiative, in particular, Elaine Tan, the head of our statistics and data innovation unit, to reach out to Alibaba and try to collaborate with them on research to look at what happened when they implemented this nudge. It's a natural experiment. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see that there's an incredibly dramatic increase in the use of no cutlery. So 70% from a baseline of maybe 2 or 3% of people not taking the cutlery from this reform. And so we found not only was there a big effect, those effects were quite persistent, lasting at least through the period of the data, 9 months. There was no negative effect on business volume for the areas that implemented the nudge. And there were also bigger effects on women and bigger effects on richer households. So, and by the way, this is used data from 100,000 consumers following them over in time, spanning the implementation in control cities and treatment cities. And so it was a great outcome. And if you go to the last slide, one thing that happened as a result of this was that the Alibaba research team managers who were collaborating on the research got very excited about the results. And we proposed to do some more experiments to implement different types of nudges which correspond to some of the different behavioral problems that Cass had alluded to earlier. So social nudges that provide social comparisons or moral suasion, financial incentives, and commitment mechanisms. And that is where we are, and we're planning to do these things with Alibaba. So what I like about this intervention is that, number one, it's about an issue ADB really cares about, which is the environment. And number two, it shows the power of online platforms to influence. If you add up the total value of saved plastic, if this is implemented nationally, it's just enormous. And of course, from a research standpoint, it's also very exciting because it uses big data in a very powerful way. All of this data was already being collected and available from Alibaba itself. So I wanted to just end with a question for Cass. I'm curious how you think about online platforms and the digital economy and the way in which that opens up new opportunities for nudges. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Really, thank you for that. That's amazing. And there are a few things that are amazing about it. One is that it uses the original things we know. So it uses knowledge to try to generate a cost-effective intervention. And then it's tested and it turned out to work. And the proposed experiments, what's really cool about them is it uses existing knowledge about what might work, but it will provide new knowledge about what does work. So often we know, if you tell people what the social norm is, that'll work, and it typically does, but we'll find out, and maybe it'll work more or less than we expect. So it's going to be knowledge generating as well as knowledge using. The potential to use online platforms both to help people and to learn what will work elsewhere, and maybe with that very platform, is an incredible opportunity. For ADB, this is a gold mine. And if you have people who are willing to work with you on shared goals like, helping people use less plastic, or doing something that involves smarter economic choices, or saving money or something, maybe it involves health, this is an unprecedented opportunity.
Thank you. I think we heard from everyone. It would be great to have another round. So I hope you come back, Cass, to ADB, and we have more conversations with you. I have one question from the audience because I want to make sure the audience is heard. If we were doing a sludge audit, where would we start?
Well, I think of two things. One is, where would it be easiest to do it? And the other is, where would it have the largest impact to do it? So, and the answer to the two questions might not be the same. So it might be that it's really easy to do it in a place where the impact is modest, and it's really hard to do it in the place where the impact is really large. I need to know more about ADB to know, but I think the easy place to do it is internally. So with some sort of process, it might involve ADB itself. It may be ADB's work with some other country. To do a sludge audit, even over a 2-week period, can generate surprising answers. And the surprises are often bad surprises, but that's good because it's a reform opportunity.
Thank you very much, Cass. I think what you just said means for us that we are doing already sludge audits as part of the knowledge management roadmaps that we have, and as part of the new country knowledge programming, and actually also in our own department. I would like to thank Bruno for many of the business streamlining initiatives he has led in the last year. And I would like to close this session now and thank you so much, Cass, for the terrific book that hopefully we'll be co-authoring with you, and for the panelists. Thank you, Albert and Bruno and Tom. And with that, I now wish you all a great lunch. At least in Manila, we'll have lunch. And after that, we'll hear more about how we are reducing sludges and how we're using nudges in our new dynamic country knowledge programming. And finally, I hope you all now understand why behavioral insights is so critical for knowledge management and actually for all reform efforts that are ongoing in the bank. Thank you very much.